child poverty costs the United States about $1 trillion a year on the back end in terms of incarceration, health ailments, lower economic productivity. They're far more likely to drop out of high school, to have a kid young. It's a disaster.
But maybe no one wants to admit that free money works, because that would undermine the entire system of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you just have to work harder, poverty is a result of your own personal failings. Maybe free money just really works. Hello, I'm Ash Sarkar and welcome to Downstream. Today, I'll be talking to Andrea Elliott, the New York Times reporter and author of Invisible Child, Poverty, Survival and Hope in an American City. Invisible Child follows Dasani, an 11-year-old girl from Fort Greene, Brooklyn, who when we meet her is living crammed in one room with her 7 siblings and her parents, Chanel and Supreme, in a homeless shelter. This is a story about intergenerational discrimination, racism, poverty, and whether or not lifting one individual out of impoverishment can actually have devastating personal consequences. So, without further ado, here's Andrea Elliott. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
Thanks for having me.
So this book, Invisible Child, it is about Dasani, an 11-year-old when you first meet her, living in New York City. But as Michael Harrington said, there is not just one America, there is the other America. So which New York City is Dasani living in?
I would say Dasani's living in both. I love this question because precisely what made me so interested in following her for so many years was the fact that she had sort of one foot in the world that she was grounded in, which is the world of deep poverty, but another foot in the world of gentrified upper middle class New York was right in front of her. And so she was straddling this divide constantly. And I think that her childhood in that setting, to me, kind of summarizes the bigger picture of what the modern American city has become, which I think probably relates to parts of the UK as well. And of course, in other parts of the world, we see this return to the city, revitalization, gentrification, whatever you want to call it. It's in creating a kind of close encounter between the wealthy and the poor, and especially in a place like New York City. It's a striking thing to be a kid growing up that way when you are faced with everything you don't have.
So who is she and who are her family for the audience who haven't gotten their paws on the book yet? But they will.
I hope so. Dasani is a member of a family of 10 members, 8 kids, 2 married parents. When I met them, they were living crammed into one room in a very decrepit homeless shelter in Brooklyn. This is a Black family that had been for generations surviving multiple kinds of struggles and forms of injustice that this book looks at. She nonetheless tries to transcend all of that and reach for something more.
I mean, can you do a bit of yank-splaining for us? Because there's lots of things in the book which are quite specific to an American context. And you talk about things like the GI Bill and redlining. So what are these things which have impacted Dasani's family for generations?
So coming out of slavery, and I telegraphed the history, this sort of broader history of the racial divide in America through this family. And so what we see is through a genealogist, I was able to trace Dasani back 3 centuries to the white enslavers of her family. And then following their trek out of the South, out of North Carolina, what happened in the 20th century was the Great Migration, where more than 6 million African Americans left the South in pursuit of something better. They went to
like not being at risk of lynching kind of on a daily basis.
Exactly, the Jim Crow South. Her great-grandfather's ticket out was the military, like a lot of African Americans. World War II is happening. Now we're, in the 1940s. And he joins the army at a time when the United States military is still segregated. He becomes a Buffalo Soldier and he goes to Europe to fight the Nazis and fascists in the name of freedom, as part of a segregated unit of the army, and then returns to the Jim Crow South. Even with 3 bronze medal stars, he is denied the kinds of benefits that his fellow white veterans are getting through something called the GI Bill, which was created to basically what it is credited with doing is creating the American middle class. So what happens is that the GI Bill makes possible mortgages so that you can buy homes, loans so that you can start businesses, training, loans to go to college. All of those things were on paper technically available to Black veterans. But when they showed up at the bank, when they applied for that college, they were facing this wall of racism, and they were not able to penetrate it. And so what we see with June Sykes is what we've seen with a lot of Black families, which is basically that they were kept back, and that there was this massive divide that occurred in the 50s where American white families were able to plant the seeds of wealth and create intergenerational wealth, whenever we hear about the safety net, it always drives me crazy because we talk about it in this public sense, the public safety net. And should people be allowed to depend on the safety net or not? But we never talk about the private safety net, right?
Homeownership.
The fact homeownership is key. And in the United States, what you saw was that for white families, it was critical because what it wound up amounting to was that they amassed 10 times the net worth of Black families over time because of real estate and because of this ability to pass generation through generation, this security, this safety net. He was denied that. He wound up not just stuck as a renter in Brooklyn, stuck in the inner city, but not even able to work in his chosen profession. He was trained as a mechanic. He had been repairing military vehicles under fire. I mean, by any stretch of the imagination, he was a trained mechanic. And yet this was a time when unions were closed to Black workers, when even just job opportunities were closed. And so I looked at his wage records. And this is another thing about the book, is that the book looks at the family through not just oral history, but documents, right? So we got more than 14,000 records. Because to be poor is to be followed, is to be monitored, is to be surveilled. And there is a long paper trail. And in that paper trail, I was able to see his wage records and the fact that he worked more than 30, he cobbled together a living with 30 jobs, doing things like sweeping floors, mopping, but he never got to do what he was trained to do. And I really think that when you look at Dasani, who's a 21st century story, a kid who just finished her childhood, she's about to turn 21. This book covers the first part. It comes out, it's interesting. I'm actually thinking about this for the first time. It came out in 2021. I started following her in 2001. So it's that first chunk of the new century is her childhood is the real-time story of this book.
I mean, you call her a child of New York, I think, in the series you did for the New York Times. And I found that really interesting in terms of, she crystallizes an awful lot of the social and the economic forces which are shaping the city. When you first met her, what was she like?
She just excited my imagination. She was just like this kid who jumped out at you and said, boo. And there was something about her that everyone found magnetic. Everyone around her wanted to pay attention to her. She was the sort of the leader of the pack, and she had this magnetism. And I thought she just was so creative, the way she spoke, the way she narrated her own experience of being poor, the way she connected the dots between her life and these bigger problems. For example, the bus drivers union was angry at the mayoral administration, at the Bloomberg administration. And so they went on strike. And she was so aware of politics, of things that were happening around her because of how those things affected her. Because what it meant for her was that she had to walk her siblings to school because they couldn't take the bus. And she was so angry at the bus strike. Or she was furious when Mayor Bloomberg said that he was going to ban supersized sodas in his fight against obesity, because for her family, one supersized soda is a thing that you share among 8 mouths.
I mean, have you heard of Jamie Oliver?
Yeah.
I mean, so he's leading this campaign at the moment to ban 2-for-1 deals on junk food.
Yeah.
And we've got this thing, even amongst, well-intentioned liberals in this country, where things like obesity in childhood or the prevalence of diabetes amongst low-income households, it's seen as like a personal failing. But throughout the book, the attention that you draw to food and drink and sweet treats, it's communicating something very different. Could you just tell us a bit more about that?
Poverty in general tends to be framed as a personal failing. This is, I think, the biggest takeaway for me, having spent all of this time with this family, is that I saw that just ran against the reality in such an obvious way, that they were doing everything they could to survive. And part of that survival is finding moments of levity, is finding relief. And until, as Chanel, Dasani's mother, always says, until you've walked my shoes for a mile, you can't judge me. Be in my shoes before you cast any judgments. And what I think she means by that is what a lot of people described to me, and what I saw firsthand was just this constant, the drudgery, the immense amount of energy and exhaustion that goes into just surviving every day. When something good happens, when you fall in love, and you might end up having unprotected sex and getting pregnant, when you suddenly have the opportunity to have a drink, when you're stressed out of your mind, and almost any middle-class, upper middle-class parent listening to this can understand that. When money comes in and you want to just suddenly seem like a person who has, rather than what you've felt like for so long, which is a person who lacks. It's just very hard to summarize the power of the seductive power of those things. And I think that people don't understand that when they make these judgments.
I mean, when I was reading this book, I was thinking about all the things that I was taught about poverty literally at school. So I did a sociology GCSE and A-level. And one of the first things you learn is deferred gratification and immediate gratification.
Right.
And the thing that you learn is good middle-class people are smart and they know about deferred gratification, that you wait until your desires are satisfied, therefore you get something better, whereas poor people are stupid and they're locked in the cycle of immediate gratification. And there was a moment where you're describing Chanel's attitude to sweet treats, so like Twizzlers, which in this country were made out of turkey, but I imagine are like a sweetie in America. And it's a way of just saying,
they
like,
might be made out of turkey in America. So that would be
like, maybe they
that
are.
would be my biggest breakthrough moment of my visit here in the UK, is to learn that Twizzlers may be made out of turkey.
It's going to be Soylent Green is made of people, but like Twizzlers are made of turkey. But it's a way of just going like, this is a treat for my children. I want to give them a treat. I want to give them something so they don't feel like the world is just full of stuff they can't have.
I'm so glad you bring this up, because I think this idea that different classes of people make different choices is precisely what's so wrong about our approach to a family like Dasani's. The idea that they've chosen immediate gratification, or that they've decided that planning is not the way. It's a life, and I think her story really shows this, where not only is it dangerous to plan in some ways, because what you're trying to do is guard your survival, but the skill set that is required for guarding your survival is entirely moored in the present. It's about being alert. It's about being malleable. It's about being able to adjust to things, to change, to switch gears. It's the exact opposite of the whole sort of grit craze and what is being taught to a lot of parents who want their kids to succeed in America are following this mantra that you want your kids to become gritty, which means that you want them to be able to pursue a long-term goal, which means delaying gratification. It means, let's say it's violin, practicing every day, stretching yourself to do better, being passionate about that, having the discipline. How are you able to do those things if you're Dasani when you can't even do your homework because you don't have proper lighting, because you're being interrupted, your sleep is being interrupted? This is a thing, this is like a small detail. Everybody, when we talk about the poor, we think about the broad strokes, things like hunger, things like, being cold, not having the right clothes. But what about the more subtle things that are just as, in some ways, even more of an assault on her? One of those things is noise interruption. Just the fact that she couldn't sleep through the night because the sink was dripping in her room leads to an inability to concentrate, which then cascades into problematic behavior at school, which then leads to lower grades, or maybe you get held back, and then that leads to... And I didn't plan that roll of thunder. I'm going to just think of a great place to conclude this point. But it leads to catastrophe. I mean, but it doesn't begin with catastrophe.
One of the things that really struck me about Dasani's father, Supreme, and I think you discussed this, is the kind of cumulative psychological impact his life has had on him. So he's in the state of hyperarousal to threat. And when he's in crowds, he feels incredibly paranoid. And there's a level of volatility which is woven into his everyday life. How much of this is a story of untreated mental health issues? Or is that only a side part of this story?
I mean, there's so many pieces to this, but I'm really glad you brought that up. I think it's untreated traumas that have resulted from, generations of problems that do result ultimately in mental health struggles. But it's not like the root is mental health problems. I think in his case, he was the victim of a lot of trauma.
I mean, I don't think the mental health problems are the cause, but I certainly think that they're a symptom of the social environment that they're in.
They are symptomatic. Yes. I think it's a way of, in a way, it's the crazy, quote unquote, person in the village is the person who speaks the truth and the person who is most kind of grounded. I think of these small town metaphors, but, and I have some of that in my own family history, but, just places that we've spent time in, including a small town in England called Turville, where I spent a summer, and there was the person wandering the village who spoke out loud and to himself, and everyone said, he's mad as a hatter. But I always thought maybe he's onto something. I don't know. I mean, sometimes expressions of mental illness are really a way of kind of sounding the injustice that's going on and the craziness that nobody else will name or speak.
I mean, one of the, crazy things that you do name and speak is the impact of class, social class, intergenerational poverty, being held back. And particularly post-Trump and in this country, post-Brexit, there has been a kind of backlash against the cities. So there's been a kind of, you've ignored flyover country or the Red Wall for too long. This is where the decent, authentic working class live, and the city is packed full to the brim of elites. And one of the things you're doing with Dasani's story is saying, well, hang on, there's a connection here between the extreme wealth, the gentrification of Brooklyn, and the extreme poverty. How was it following the story, from the sort of, just after the 2010s through to Trump and afterwards, in terms of this sense of class and who gets to claim to be working class America?
That's such a great question, because this all began within the setting of Occupy Wall Street. It was 2012. I had been immersed in writing about Islam in a post 9/11 America, Islam in the West, for many years, and I was ready for something new. And it seemed to me like a good moment to look at inequality, because there was a raised kind of public consciousness around this. And so in that moment is when I reached for this book called There Are No Children Here by Alex Kotlowitz, which had come out 20 years earlier, and which was about two brothers in the Chicago public housing projects. And as I was rereading it, because I hadn't seen it in 20 years, this book, but it's a classic, I kept thinking, how much has really changed? How much has really changed? Did some research, saw that 1 in 5 American children were at that time, 2012, growing up poor, which was the exact same child poverty rate as when Alex Kotlowitz's book came out 20 years earlier. That made my jaw drop. And as I continued to look at this, against the backdrop of all the sort of increased polarization that we were seeing in the news, in the American public square, I decided to pursue a story about children specifically because I wanted, in a sense, to call attention to their plight while sidestepping all the political noise, the partisan noise that is so often directed at the poor by blaming the parents, the adults, the supremes, that they've chosen this path, therefore they need to pay, that it's their personal responsibility. The whole politics around assigning blame, around personal responsibility, seemed to be almost an impediment to being able to write this story that was so important, because no matter where you land on the political spectrum, you could be a Trump voter, you could be on the completely other end of that. You can't deny that there were at the time 16 million, now it's 13 million American poor children, and that they are not responsible for their their dilemma, right? That they're not responsible for their predicament. And so to focus on them seemed like the way around the sort of politics of it. And yet, as the years went by and the conversation shifted and things became more polarized, what I came personally to see was that it was really, really clear that even just focusing on the children was a bit of it was sort of like telling the reader I was doing one thing when what I really was doing was another, which was writing about past childhoods. I was trying to get...
So was it a little bit maybe of a cop-out where you're like, well, no one hates kids?
Exactly. I think it was. Because actually what we're hating is what happened to the childhoods of the parents that are in charge of these kids also. What we should hate, I should say, what we should focus on is all of the unseen childhoods that came before her. And so I tried to do that with this book.
I mean, is there something personal going on here for you? Because within the book, one of the things you talk about is, you know, you can see how Dasani's parents are struggling with addiction, and there were mirrors for your own personal experience with your sibling. Was there a frustration there in terms of maybe how addiction is framed as a failure of, you know, moral competence as opposed to a health issue?
Well, what I will say is my brother struggled for decades with severe alcoholism and addiction, and I was really involved in his care. And I think what that did in terms of the book and in terms of my ability to write the book was that it helped connect me to Chanel and Supreme. It helped them see that I understood this issue from multiple perspectives, and that it had actually come home for me. It wasn't just something that I was visiting. It was something that I had lived through in my own family. Addiction crosses all boundaries of class and race. And my brother tragically passed away in December. And what I feel grateful for is that, you know, he also modeled for me just how complicated it is. Recovery is so messy, and we judge way too easily. And so I think when people respond to this book by saying, I don't feel that you judge, it's because, if anything, I have felt that my family, or my brother specifically, was really harshly judged for many years and rejected actually socially. And there's a wonderful book by Gabor Mate called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which looks at the hardcore addicted. And it's really about, I recognized my brother in his work. He serves this community in Canada that is, these are people who, he believes in harm reduction, who simply aren't able to get sober. And so why is that the only answer? Why is that the only prescription? Is society says this is your way out, is to get sober. And if you don't, you failed. For some people, it's not possible, but there are other ways to treat that population. Now, I don't think that Dasani's parents fall into that category, but I just think that you asked about judgment, and when it comes to also being poor, trying to transcend poverty, escape poverty, we're very hooked on the escape narrative, on leaving communities behind, finding your way into some other land where you speak differently, where you have different quote unquote material values. Why is that the answer? We just have a very, I think, often prescriptive and limited view about how people are supposed to succeed.
This is something which happens in Dasani's own life. So she ends up going to a boarding school which doesn't take fees from the pupils, as I understand it. It is essentially a form of foundation-funded school.
Can I tell you, I'll just summarize it.
Yeah.
So you guys have Cadbury. We have our own Cadbury village modeled after Cadbury chocolate. It's called Hershey. It's in Pennsylvania, and his name
it's like Cadbury without the cocoa solids.
In some ways, Milton Hershey was somewhat unoriginal because he modeled the whole thing after the Cadbury village, and he wanted to do the same thing. But that's how Hershey came to be. He's the chocolate magnate of America, the Henry Ford of chocolate. He was the first person to make it a mass-produced product. He brought chocolate to America, essentially, and created, out of his fortune, this town and the school in his name, and the school is funded by his fortune. It's the richest private school in America. It has a more than $17 billion endowment.
That's like the GDP of Luxembourg or something.
It's stunning. Hershey School is very wealthy, and what it does is it tries to rescue people from poverty. children. So if you graduate from a school, you're graduating from poverty. That means the school has done its job. It's the opposite of a legacy school. If your kids qualify, that means it hasn't done its job. If you're poor, it has failed. If you leave poverty, it has succeeded. And that's its entire purpose. And what it's like this sort of alternate universe. It struck me as almost a bizarre kind of utopia to be among the students there, because they were housed 12 per married couple in these beautiful homes, given everything they needed, a full wardrobe, braces, driving lessons, swimming classes. And so that's where she landed. She went to Hershey.
I mean, it seemed to me like within her own life, it was like there were these two tracks. And like one was her experience at Hershey, where she's removed from her family effectively. And she's told, you have to speak a different way. You have to carry yourself a different way. And her mom, Chanel, is saying, there's no home for you to come back to. And at the same time, her family's being broken up by Child Protective Services, and they're being paired off and put through the system. I mean, did you intend for that to be a kind of mirroring, which is, almost the foster care system was this like horrible doppelganger of the boarding school environment?
That's such a smart question. I mean, I didn't intend, but it certainly seemed that way to me. I followed the story at every turn with the help of a lot of video and audio recording devices, because I couldn't be in all places at all times. But the family was very, involved in helping me with my research. And I did toggle between them in real time. And I would race from Hershey back to Staten Island because I was so struck by the contrast between those two worlds. And at the same time, some of the parallels. I love that question. For the viewers who, like myself, learn everything they know about Staten Island from like Wu-Tang Clan songs, what is the difference experientially for Dasani when she's making that move from New York City to Hershey, like visually, architecturally, socially? She goes from the northern part of Staten Island, Wu-Tang territory. By the way, Wu-Tang is the most famous export of Staten Island, but it is also a place where there's a stark racial divide. And if you go south of the highway that is known as the Mason-Dixon line, you find mansions and rolling hills. But Dasani's part of Staten Island really felt like an urban environment of a lot of homes that had been foreclosed upon, stray dogs, bodegas, litter on the ground, to Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was fields of corn and a kind of quiet that she had never known. The thing that they taught her was what the school saw as a survival mechanism, which is what they call code switching. And I will say, it wasn't just Hershey that believed in this. A lot of Dasani's Black mentors also believed in this, including one of her teachers from her inner city school, Faith Hester, who had, told Dasani in front of me when she was still in the city, in that classroom, it's okay to say ain't in one neighborhood and to say isn't in another context. And you can do both, and that doesn't make you any less of who you are. You're just learning to kind of go between these environments, and that's how you open yourself up to many different worlds. So it wasn't just Hershey but Hershey's whole idea was you switch between modalities as a form of survival so that you can stay whole inside. So you speak one way here at Hershey, you say isn't. You go back to Staten Island, if you want to say ain't, you say ain't. And by doing that, and everyone, this was the thing that most struck me was was convincing to me, was everyone code switches. We code switch when we're on the phone with a colleague, and then we get off the phone and we're on the phone with our mom. We're speaking in slightly different tones. Teenagers speak in one way when they're texting and in another way when they're talking. So people are accustomed to switching. But what it wound up feeling like for Dasani, especially when her family began to suffer so much in her absence and was broken up, was that when she was back in Hershey trying to be this other thing, that what she was really doing was almost like an act of erasure. And that the most authentic part of herself, the truest part of herself, she was being asked to erase. And she couldn't feel okay that way. She couldn't feel okay with that.
I mean, is that the difference between being lifted out of poverty, literally like an airlift. It's you as an individual being extracted from your context and your community to being able to rise with your family, with your community.
That's what she wants. You just described Dasani's own solution is keep me in my community, and I want it both ways, and let me transcend. And maybe I can lift them up with my success as well, by the way.
Maybe she should run for office.
It's very, very possible.
I would vote for her. I kind of want to talk about the flip side to code switching, which is what Chanel, I think, calls being sheltonized, which is you become the place where you are. Could you maybe tell me a little bit about how the environment of the homeless shelter and that social context was impacting people's behavior, their way of engaging with the world, their psychology? We talked a bit about it with like that kind of hyper alertness, but other ways perhaps.
This was a very punitive place, the Auburn Family Shelter. It was run by a city agency that had a $1 billion budget, annual budget. And yet no one would come and fix the sink that dripped every night that kept Dasani awake, to the point that this 11-year-old girl, typical for her, figured out how to be the plumber, and she fixed it herself. She was stuck in this room, and in some way she was, quote unquote, shelternized, because she had to become inured to the place. She had to adjust in a way that made it possible for her to continue in her life. Otherwise, she would fall apart. And that's what children especially are very good at doing, is adapting. But how does this play out over time? There's a concept by an ethnographer sociologist named Mindy Fullilove, who wrote a book actually by the same title called root shock. And root shock is what happens when you take plants out of their roots and try to put them in new soil. And often they don't survive. What I think is so traumatic about Dasani's experience, again, is the stuff that you don't see. What we always talk about are the obvious things: hunger, lack of clothes. We don't think about the impact of noise. We don't think about the impact of serial displacement, how it winds up making it really hard to become attached to anything. Despite all of that, Dasani had to survive within that setting. And so I felt it was really important to show, in the setting of that horrifying room, which is where the book begins, her own sense of agency. Because like any kid, she found ways to make it beautiful. She and her siblings reached up to the lamp on the ceiling and colored it with crayons to kind of make it look less dark. She'd wake up every day and go out to her window and look at the Empire State Building. She was constantly finding, but the most disturbing to some people, to the uninitiated, to outsiders, fact of that opening scene was that she delighted so much in killing the mice. She's brutal about it because the mice, it was a battle, really, between the mice.
But it's a form of being house proud. It's not brutality. It's saying, I'm going to make my place nice against this horrible thing.
Yes. It's also just a form of fighting back. And it isn't good or bad. It is. It just is. It was her way of feeling in control. But the animal lover who reads that says, oh, how could she, but actually, well, how could she kill 12 mice a week with her siblings? She had this very colorful quote. It's in the beginning, and we smashed our eyes out with sticks. We do this, we do that. It was very, very graphic. But I felt that was, whether you like it or not, you can't judge it unless you know what it's like to wake up with mice pellets in your face, or to see rat bites, in fact, on her baby sister's arm, which she did. It's a war.
I mean, do you think, this comes to a question which I've been wanting to ask, which is writing this story for what is predominantly a middle-class audience, first in terms of the New York Times readership and then the book reading audience. Do you find that your middle-class audience wants a feel-good story where the experience of poverty has enriched everyone and made them better, and they know the real world, but ultimately they've become more worldly? Do we have class-based expectations of poverty and poverty stories?
Definitely, we have class-based expectations. I try to write to as wide an audience as I can imagine. I would like to think that anyone can pick up this book and find things that feel that they resonate. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to answer that question beyond to say that I got so inside this story that I wrote what felt to me like the most sort of genuine rendering of what I'd seen and witnessed, and also what I was being told, right? It was a very collaborative process, and there was a lot of back and forth with Dasani and with her parents in terms of how I was representing their story.
I mean, the process of writing can be a collaborative effort where the reporter-subject boundary becomes less distinct, but the publishing world is different, right?
Oh, yes.
To put it bluntly, you get the Pulitzer. What do they get?
Well, I did give them the Pulitzer money, which, by the way, this is a very good, this is such a fair question. Absolutely. It's right that I have benefited now because of this book. No question. The Pulitzer means a great deal to you and me and to a tiny sliver of humanity, right?
A tiny subsection of nerds,
To Dasani really could care less. What really mattered to her was that Barack Obama had picked the book as his favorite book. But, to most of the world, the word Pulitzer is meaningless. And what was materially much more happy making for them was the fact that there was this amount of money that came with it, which of course they should have. It's their story. I told it. I feel that this is very much a shared moment.
Do you feel that the norms of journalism are fit for purpose when it comes to writing stories like this? Like the idea of, taking your sources out for dinner. And I think there's one point where Chanel's like, why can't you just give me the money? And you're like, actually, why can't I?
So there are very few norms for this kind of reporting. This is deep immersion. Not a lot of people are lucky enough to work at places that support it. It can take years. I scraped by with grants and fellowships and a lot of help along the way. But it is not an easy thing to pull off. And what was hard in the very beginning is precisely what you just said, that there wasn't this really obvious set of rules to follow, because the newsroom and journalism in general, the kind of guidebook for reporters is rooted in another era almost. And so even in the reporter handbook at the New York Times, I think you can still find it online, there is a section called Personal Relations with Sources. And the quote that I have in the book, I wrote about this in the afterword, was a city hall reporter who enjoys a weekly round of golf with a city council member, for example, risks creating an appearance of coziness. That was the guide. It's like Mad Men. It's this other era of reporting.
You're like, if you're like sipping martinis,
yes,
like at the
you need
pier.
to pay for yours and they pay for, and so of course we have our rules. They're very important to guarding the integrity of our work, but in reality, in practice, they can seem ridiculous, especially to someone who's poor. It just felt very important to me to have this conversation be an open conversation with Chanel, to be constantly going back and forth with her about why these rules exist, why we cannot pay people for their stories, that I wanted her to be voluntarily engaged, to be coming to this out as a matter of choice, not need, to not be expecting some kind of material gain out of it. But now that we're on the other side, should that happen, I will of course share in any proceeds. And they know that. And there is a trust that's been created for the family that is on my website, Andrea-Elliott.com. And you can see all about that. And it's to help Dasani and her siblings go to college.
One of the things that's really interesting about the amount of time the story has taken you to be a part of it, to immerse yourself in it, is that, of course, there are huge political and cultural changes happening outside. So, of course, you've got BLM, and you also have this attention being paid to who gets to tell stories, the discourse around cultural appropriation. Was there a part of you when you're getting ready for publication, you're like, am I going to get a load of shit for essentially being a woman who's racialized as white, telling the story of a black family? Was there a part of you going, oh, was there going to be a cancel culture brouhaha? Or was that not in your mind at all?
Of course I thought about these things a lot, and I was kind of curious more than anything about how the book would be received in the aftermath of George Floyd. For so many years before that, it seemed like there was no national conversation around these issues. And suddenly with George Floyd, and that actually, it becomes a part of the end of the book because Dasani was out on the streets protesting. and Black Lives Matter, which for her mother, who was very much victimized by the child protection system, it became her own calling, which is Black Families Matter. This is very, very much a part of the book's narrative and story, and it's in the book. I did wonder, because we were both in this incredible new moment of awakening and reckoning, and at the same time, that very thing then does beg the question, who gets to tell a story and whose right is it to tell a story? And my answer to that question is imperfect, but it's the best answer I can come up with for now, which is that I don't regard any story as my right to tell. I see a story as my duty as a journalist, like I would for any journalist of any background, that I think we are called to tell the most important stories of our times. And Dasani's life and what her life represents is an important story. And so we are trained to reach for the unknown. This is what we're wired to do as journalists. We're not supposed to stay in our own lane. If I stayed in my own lane, I would only ever write about other Latina white women in their 40s from Washington, D.C., which would be utterly boring.
It will make a great prestige HBO drama. Yeah, exactly. You're like, no, Amy Adams, another BAFTA for you.
But it's not as simple as saying, we're supposed to reach for the unknown and cross into other territory, and it's our duty to tell the most important story of the time. Because, of course, what we're also looking at are newsrooms that don't reflect the demographic background and the publishing industry that is not, that has a long way to go, right, in terms of reflecting the country that it represents, that it covers. And so, I think that the more different you are, and I've kind of spent my whole life writing about people very different from me, the greater the responsibility is to walk in with your eyes wide open, to keep yourself in check, to constantly have the conversation with the people you're writing about your difference, to square with the reader about it, and to share your platform as much as possible.
I mean, there does seem to me to be a common thread in your work when you're looking at Islam in a post 9/11 America, and then you're covering this story. It's about the role of race, racialization, the state. How has your approach to race and class changed through your work, or has it changed at all?
Oh, I would hope I'm constantly changing. I'm an eternal student, and that's how I see myself. And
I say I'm an eternal bad student.
Well, I'm sure that I don't know. Maybe I'm an eternal bad student too. I mean, what is a good student anyway? We're there to constantly, I think, as journalists, be taught everything we thought was right was wrong, is wrong, and reconsider. And I don't like to go in knowing what the story is, and if I ever do, I know that I'm not doing my job right. So it's a constant act of humility in a sense. I think that my skin color, in a sense, is a teacher for me, because what I see is it reflected in the facial expressions of the people around me as I'm reporting. It may not be skin color, it could be gender. And when I was writing about Muslims in America, and I was embedded in a mosque for 6 months in Brooklyn as a woman, non-Muslim woman, it was very much more my gender than my skin color. In Dasani's world, some people have said, well, weren't you afraid to be in the projects where there's shootings every night? And I find that to be such a troubling question, because it embedded in it is like there's something to be afraid of. I mean, sure, violence is scary, but I think that there's more to that question that's sort of driving it that has to do with race.
It's and my the way answer, in which people describe neighborhoods as sketchy.
Exactly. My response is, no, I was the cause for fear. When a white person shows up, that's how you know something's gone wrong. That's what Chanel always said. It's because they're carrying a gurney. It's because they're there because someone's about to be evicted. It's because someone's kids are about to be taken away. They are the outsider. So I was cause for alarm. So seeing my difference reflected in the fearful expressions of other people, I think, day after day. And then there were times where I would become more familiar in a particular setting. I'd get to know the neighbors, and it would be less so. But that was something that I think opened my eyes. And there's lots of particular examples I can give you about how I came to see the world in a really different way. And I don't think I can unsee what I've seen. I don't think I can unsee it. But one example I'll give you is...
You can give me as many as you like, by the way. I
mean,
that's the beauty of YouTube, which is there's no time limit.
That's also the scary part of YouTube. Okay, well, I have 2 accident-prone daughters. They are now ages 10 and 13. They literally both, in the last 2 weeks, came out of casts. One had a cast on her elbow, one on her ankle. They're just constantly throwing themselves in the path of danger. 2 journalists.
That was me as a teenager. My mom's nickname for me was the windmill because I was just always knocking shit over. Just always
go-getters.
Bruising stuff.
Their dad and I were both journalists. He was a work correspondent. So we'll go into the ER and we'll go in with our journalist questions any parent tries to advocate for their kid in the ER, boom, 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 asking, for the right x-ray and the this and the that. And I don't want the resident, I want the actual da-da-da-da doctor and, doing our thing as parents. Well, a couple of years into my time with Dasani's family, I started to notice a pattern every time we were in the ER together. And we were in the ER together. I was there reporting because that was their medical care. They didn't have a doctor. So someone had an asthma attack, someone got food poisoning, we were in the ER, whichever kid. And Chanel was always nervous. She had her back was up, she was scared, she was tense, and I couldn't tell what was going on. I just thought it was entirely about her kids, like it would be for me. It only dawned on me in January of 2015 when a nurse in the ER called in a case on the family of suspected neglect. That's what it was about. And of course, Chanel said, yeah, I'm basically a person of suspicion. I'm not just scared because there's something wrong with my kid. I have this added burden that I am going to be targeted by this system because Black and brown families in the United States are disproportionately affected by what's called mandatory reporting, which means if you're a doctor, you're a nurse, you are a teacher, any number of professions dealing with children, you are mandated by law to call in reports of suspected neglect or abuse.
It's the same in this country as well. I think the disproportionality is less bad, but it still exists here. The
vast majority of the cases that are called in are neglect cases, very different from abuse. Neglect is failure to provide. It's not intention to harm. And yet it's like the hospital, which is a place that's supposed to help you, becomes a terrifying space. And I was ashamed to realize that I had for all these years just taken it for granted that no one ever asked me a question.
I mean, when it came to child protective services, do you feel that as an institution it's redeemable? Or do you think that the practice of punishing people for being poor, the disproportionate focus on Black and brown families, that's kind of baked into the DNA?
It may be baked into the DNA, and there is a big abolition movement now underway. What I would say is there's a serious flaw in a system where you have the federal government giving 10 times the funds to programs that separate families than to programs that keep them together. There's 2 kinds of programs. And if there was a greater investment in the first kind, which is called prevention, and if prevention was even rethought as something that would be more inclusive, that would be less scary for families, that they wouldn't feel as surveilled. That's what would have kept this family together, was greater resources on the end before the kids were taken. The kids were taken from a family that was struggling with horrible housing conditions. It was on the fact that their house was falling apart that they were removed. So you're neglecting your home, and by extension, you're neglecting your children. Taken out of a poor home. Never mind that city agencies were responsible, that the food stamps have been cut off. You've read the book. You've seen all the bureaucratic lapses that happened. The parents were to blame. Taken out of that system and put in a system that went on to spend an estimated $33,000 a month on this family alone, just on those 8 kids in the foster care system. It was the single most traumatic thing I've ever witnessed as a reporter. It's the day that they were taken. And it was a life-changing event for every single person in that family. And you were talking about Trump earlier. And, one thing this brings me back to is 2016, migrant children at the border, the uproar. How in this country could we be doing this? Could we tearing? Yet it happens every day in the United States, every single day. It's just that the vast majority of those families are Black and brown. It's been happening for decades. These are neglect cases. People scramble it with abuse and say, oh, those are bad parents. Those are parents who don't love their kids. These kids need to go into foster care. Rarely is foster care the answer.
I mean, so I feel like I'm confessing that I was raised by the mafia or something. But everyone in my family practically works in social services, works in child protection. And my grandmother, when she qualified as a social worker, she was in the process of qualifying. This was back in the late 70s, kind of 80s. She was like, hang on, all I'm doing is being told to remove children from poor black and brown people for being poor. And that's the only bad thing that's happening here. There's no abuse. There's a lot of love, but people are struggling with poverty. And my grandma wrote the book Black Perspectives in Social Work. And one of the things that her and my mom always said
want to read this.
Oh, yeah. So that's my grandma.
Your grandmother wrote this?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm like a real nerd. I'm a nerd when it comes to this kind of text.
Well, tell you what, maybe come around, chat to my mom. She will cook the biggest biryani you've seen in your life.
I love biryani.
So that's what she does. Whenever I bring someone to the house, she's like, it is time for all of the onion bhajis that you could possibly support on the weight of one table. But one of the things that my grandmother and my mom talk about a lot is it feels like there's a vision of our job which could be so different, where hang on, your fridge is empty, so why don't we fill it up? Okay, you're really struggling to clean your house because you're caring for your disabled kid and your benefits have just been cut. Like, why don't we just do that for you? Or why don't we have a benefit system that you can live on? Okay, so your eldest son...
Because we never pay for poverty on the front end. That's the answer. We pay for it on the back end. There's a lack of political willpower to say, let's put billions of dollars into programs that actually bring money into homes. We just had an experiment in this, which was the child tax credit. It was guaranteed income for families in America from July to December of 2021 related to pandemic relief. It was radical what it did for poor families. It lifted more than 3 million children out of poverty every month. As soon as that program ended, because of lack of political willpower to keep it going, we saw a 40% increase in poverty, in child poverty in the United States. That's stunning. Now, people say we don't want to give money to poor families. These parents are irresponsible. Well, Urban Institute actually did a study on how the money was spent in a bunch of these homes and found that more than half of the adults spent the money on food, another 30% on clothes. The rest, it was like utilities and school books. Why? Because they actually care about their kids. Because actually most people want to be good parents. They want their children to stay home. They want to have stable homes. This idea that they're so different from us is driving this. And then again, so there's a lack of willpower, I think, when it comes to creating a stronger safety net. It's too costly. But no one ever talks about how costly child poverty is.
But it's also like prisons aren't cheap. So, none of the things that you do to punish people for being poor are cheap. I mean, the American police force, famously expensive.
Exactly. This Professor Mark Robert Rank wrote a book recently about the American poor. It's called Poorly Understood. And he estimated that child poverty costs the United States about $1 trillion a year on the back end in terms of incarceration, health ailments, lower economic productivity. They're far more likely to drop out of high school, to have a kid young. It's a disaster. And yet nobody ever talks about that. It's like, we don't want to. So in this family, let's go back to Dasani, $33,000 a month, suddenly the system is spending on those 8 kids in foster homes where several of them were abused or traumatized. If you had just given a fraction of that money to the parents and kept them together with the kids, I have no doubt it wouldn't have been perfect, what family is, but it would have been way better for them.
But maybe no one wants to admit that free money works, because that would undermine the entire system of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You just have to work harder. Poverty is a result of your own personal failings. Maybe free money just really works.
I think it's been proven to work when you look at the research that shows what it did for children in America in 2021.
I mean, I want to just move on a little bit and ask you, I mean, this is a book which is about childhoods. It's about Dasani's childhood. It's about her parents' childhoods as well, and how that has come to bear on their children. Did spending so much time with other people's childhoods make you reflect on your own at all? Or is that the kind of question you hate as a reporter because you're like, shit, I've got to talk about me?
That's the kind of question I love to ask. It takes one to know one. I have a hard time talking about myself, and I really resisted writing about myself in this book. I kind of cringe when reporters get too comfortable in the first person. It's like, dude, it's not about you. Okay, let's just keep the focus where it's supposed to.
I was the main character.
But I felt like I had to write about myself in order to maybe in some ways like dissipate any questions or lessen the noise around who is the voice writing this. If anything, it might have helped to the reader to get more comfortable. And I did talk a little bit about my childhood in the book. And what I would say, I mean, the thing that it made me, I guess one thing it made me think, and actually this I have not written about, is how big a role luck plays. Just the luck of being born in a particular zip code and in a particular family, and the randomness of that. And then also, you know, my father also passed away recently. I was raised by someone who had himself been raised in a working class blue collar town outside of Buffalo, New York. And he, you know, graduated first in his class and got a full ride to Harvard. And so I was raised very much inside this story of the American dream. My mother came from Chile, but she also came from a pretty educated background, and she'd never suffered poverty as a child. And the two of them went on, you know, to get master's degrees and have good lives. And I think that being with Dasani and her family and uncovering their family history to the extent that we did really caused me to see the holes in the narrative around the American dream.
I mean, when we think of our own family, we tend to highlight the extraordinary feats of heroism that everybody accomplished. And particularly when there's the immigrant story, right? It's almost like they're slaying dragons and fighting lions, and they had to do these incredible things to survive. And we talk about talent, and we talk about how extraordinary they are. Is maybe the uncomfortable truth that everyone is really extraordinary, just some people are extraordinary and lucky.
Yes, and most are not. And this is the biggest problem I have with the escape from poverty narrative that we venerate in Hollywood and in fiction, this idea that this celebration of the one who made it out, as if that was a thing to escape. And really it's all about willpower and talent and might and drive. And it lets everyone off the hook because, and it's these tales also, by the way, do deserve to be celebrated when they happen, but they negate the vast majority of children who are just as talented but don't escape, which then causes you to look at why aren't they leaving? And that's what I think Dasani's story forces us to look at, is why couldn't she leave?
I mean, you talked about Dasani's magnetism, but was she this kind of unique, extraordinary child, or was she just the one you paid attention to?
I'll never forget the day that I met Dasani. I was standing outside her homeless shelter, and she and her 7 siblings and her mother walked out in single file. And there was such a kind of unity and presence to them. And also just a spark and a charisma. And her in particular, she's just a spitfire. She was a kid who had so much to say and wanted to say, to speak her truth, and call my attention. And that was unique because I'd been at that point searching for months for a kid to write about. And I'd looked in different parts of the country. I'd looked at different kind of demographic portraits of kids. My checklist as a reporter going into this whole project was very, very different from Dasani's family. Basically, I was looking for what I was told and what the research shows to be more the representative child.
So what
poverty.
Was the checklist?
Well, the checklist in some ways would have been an easier fit for me. Part Hispanic, I am also, and I speak Spanish, and so I was interviewing moms in Spanish. Probably multiracial, most likely smaller composition, so a family, so a mom with 2 kids from different dads. Not deeply poor, somebody hovering on the poverty line. This is more representative of what you're seeing. You know, somebody who's cobbled together 2 part-time jobs without benefits, falling in and out of homelessness. That was the family. And
so is that the deserving poor?
Exactly. I mean, in some ways, I think that is what drove in an unspoken manner, the guidance I got, maybe. I think, also we work in news. We look for what's new, right? The new face, the new whatever. We want to tell a new chapter of the story of poverty, which is this eternal story. By the time I met Dasani, the checklist was out the window, and I'm so glad and grateful it was, because she obviously, her life deserved the attention that it got from me. But also, if you look at the criteria, I mean, this is a family, it's a huge family. They were chronically poor, they were chronically homeless, and her parents were married, which was unusual. There were so many things about them that wouldn't have fit. And yet none of that mattered, because I knew that I needed to be moved by the story that I was presented with, because if I am, then the reader will be. And so I kind of just ignored all of this stuff. In retrospect, looking back, I'm so grateful that this was a Black family and that this was the story that I actually needed to learn as an American, that I needed to delve into to become, I think, a more aware person, frankly, of all kinds of dynamics that I was blind to before.
So how do you, as a writer, stop this from becoming a kind of poverty porn, urban safari for a middle-class audience, voyeuristic kind of enterprise? What do you do in the process of putting together the story to guard against that?
It's funny. No one's, to this day, called it poverty porn. I think good work is good work. It's serious, deep, investigative, years spent immersed. When you approach your subject with respect and with seriousness, what you are accessing, I would hope, is a depth and a nuance that demands the reader's attention in a way that something that's voyeuristic, is fleeting, is cheap, is superficial, is surface level, does not. That's a different kind of writing. That's not what I ever aspired to do. And
has that ever been an anxiety for you, where you go, shit, I don't want this to be a kind of like Henry Mayhew, overly sentimentalized exercise of writing?
As writers, I mean, we all come in with our insecurities. Nothing I write is ever good enough to my mind. I think that my work is protected by that approach of always trying to get it right and never feeling totally satisfied.
It's like the healthy level of self-loathing that you need as a writer.
Probably. Or unhealthy.
I mean, I think it's like unhealthy from a therapeutic perspective, but from a writing perspective, I think everyone needs that little voice of not good enough. Because it stops you from being.
It's not just writing, it's reporting. I mean, you have to be constantly second guessing yourself and being open to being challenged, and just humble enough, in a truly humble way, not in a humble brag bullshit way, but in like wait, I really don't understand this. I am lost. I had so many moments like that.
So how did Dasani's family challenge you through this process? Because you talk about it being collaborative and they get to talk back. How did they do that?
Race was front and center in our conversations from day one. And, history was deeply important to them. The idea that history isn't history, that it is a part of their current experience, and that they wanted me to see what they saw, that the carceral system, for example, is a modern form of slavery, that slavery was always in the conversation, connecting the past to the present, making this point really to them was important. And ultimately, I think it found its way into the book. I think it was a remarkable act of bravery on their part to open their lives up as much as they did. I can't really think of an instance. I told them very, very early on that if something was private, they should tell me that. Forget off the record, who knows what that means. And almost, I can't recall. I mean, maybe a couple of instances where it came up, and those were things that, this is so often the case, really wouldn't matter to the public and don't change the story in any fundamental or germane way. I once wrote about a terrorist, an American terrorist who went to Somalia, and I was interviewing his father. I'll never forget this. And this is a person who'd been accused of beheadings and a lot of acts of violence. And we went through all of that, and he was listening. And then I said, okay, let's go back to his high school years. So I understand that as a freshman, he smoked pot. He did what? He was horrified. He's like, I can't believe you're going to put that in there. And I was like, but there's videos of him.
Maybe he should have smoked more pot and done less beheadings.
Anyway, it's interesting. It's like people, what matters to them is so rarely what matters to the public. But I feel that really what Dasani's family did with the book was to help ensure its accuracy. We had a very rigorous fact check. I have a teenager who is on her phone a lot. I know Dasani's on her phone a lot. I did not trust that Dasani would sit with this giant book and read it. She also said to me, it's my life. I already know what's in it. And I was like, okay, I'm going to have to do what I'm about to describe to you. Took her and her sister to a very secluded place for 5 days in Virginia and read them the book over the course of 5 days to see their reaction and also to talk about certain passages. It was a fact check, but it was also, I felt it was what I owed to them. At the very end of that torturous process of listening to the book being read out loud by me, at the very end, Dasani read the last passage. I have a video of this. She read the last passage. She said, "Are we done?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "Hallelujah." And she jumped on the table and started dancing. And it wasn't because she liked my writing. It's because she was so happy.
It's over. This hostage situation is over.
I just want to get out of the countryside and back to the city. But, it was, I think there was so much back and forth in the reporting and a conversation around, she got so tired of me asking her, what were you thinking in this moment? She's like, Drea, if you ask me one more time what I was thinking, I'm going to kill you.
It's also what I'm thinking now, reflecting on a moment, and what I was thinking in the moment are two different things.
Often I do it in the moment too. Like literally 5 minutes later, I'd be like, what were you thinking? Because of that. And I don't trust memory. And it was a very neurotic process.
So I'm like,
she's really sick of it.
As a 10-year-old, I was thinking with this level of sophistication, like probably well done. Like, I don't trust my own memories at all. I think I narrativize my own too much.
No memory can be really trusted. And that's why I rely so much on audio and video, because I don't want to ever take license.
So one last question, because speaking of hostage situations, I've been keeping you locked in what's effectively a shipping container in Bermondsey. Where are the family now? What's Dasani up to? What are her siblings up to?
Dasani is paving her own way forward. She's in a good place. She has been reunited with her mother and two of her siblings. They are living not in the shelter system anymore. They're living in a rental in the Bronx. Those two facts, that she's been reunified with her family and that she has stable housing, I think were pivotal things that improved her life. And as a result, she was able to graduate from high school, and she is in community college. The most surprising development is that her current goal is to become a real estate broker and eventually maybe a mogul. Talk about revenge. You're going to be like,
I was just talking about redlining and the impact of gentrification. Oh, jeez.
Well,
okay, selling Staten Island, let's go.
I mean, this could be considered the upside to gentrification, is increased exposure to this other world and different, and a kind of broader palette, in a sense, of ideas about how to see yourself in that world. And she really is serious about it. She's like, I love houses. I love seeing them empty, and then I love filling them. And this is one of the great privileges of the passage of time, of being able to be in someone's life for so many years, is that I got to watch her grow up. And so I'm reminded of that time, or many times, when she was 11 and she would talk to me about her favorite show, Criminal Minds. And it wasn't the crime scenes. It was the rich
homes.
People's homes and the sizes of their closets.
Makes so much sense to me. It's just, I'm sorry, I feel like you've just like unlocked like a memory. So when we were growing up, we were precariously housed for a bit. And then afterwards, I was just obsessed with building houses in The Sims. And I still am obsessed with like interior decoration shows and anything to do with like nesting and houses. And I love looking at other people's houses, and I'm obsessed with houses, and I never made that connection before.
Wow.
And so the siblings, what's going on with the siblings?
So because of what happened in foster care, several of them have suffered quite a bit. The person who's really taken the biggest hit is her brother Khalik. He's facing a murder charge. He's in Rikers. I talk to him once a week. He is not doing well. I will never forget talking to him. One of the first times we spoke, the call, you only get a certain amount of minutes of an allotment, and then you have 1 minute to go kind of announcement that comes into the call. And the calls are all recorded, by the way. And I said, okay, Khalik, well, why don't you call me next time you get a chance? I think we need to say goodbye. And he goes, not until the minute's up. I want every bit of the minute that's left before we hang up. And so we just sat there on the phone. It was like, really? So they're in different places. Everyone else is okay. Mm-hmm. So 3 are with an aunt, another one is in the foster care system, and 3 are with the mom.
Thank you so much for spending all this time with us here on Novara Media, Downstream. Is there anything that you would like to draw the audience's attention to? Perhaps they've read this book already and they want to maybe find out a bit more about your work or other things you've written about Dasani and her family. Where should they go?
The thing that I would most want people to know about is the Invisible Child Family Trust, which is a way to support Dasani's future and that of her siblings by contributing to their education. And information on that is on Twitter, and it's also on my website.
Well, look, all of you are on Twitter. You spend too much time on Twitter, so go there now. Andrea, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ash. Thank you.